full disclosure, I've never had the opportunity to go to Colombia, so unfortunately I've never seen a small farm in Colombia. I have, however, stood in a burning cane field in Belize, which is akin to a page out of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where it's somewhere along the lines of Armageddon, where the sky is blocked out and there's fire crackling all around you. And this is a small cane farm, a family-based farm, and I just want to tell you to sort of get a picture of the difficulties of the livelihood of small farmers. This particular cane farm was owned by a family. As with other traditional farms, the expertise, the land, is passed down from generation to generation. And the generations all work on the farm to provide for the family income. And so the reason that cane fields are burned is to eliminate the stalk around the cane, and then each cane is cut one by one using a machete. And it's done by all generations. And this then contributes to the household income. It's a backbreaking, difficult way to make a living. They are not paid by wage, it's their farm. And so they're the ones who make the income and also are able to grow crops for their own table. I did grow up in a small rural farming community in northeast Iowa. My grandparents were small family farmers, and if you asked anyone in the small town that I grew up in, they would say the small family farm has been in decline for at least 30 to 40 years. And it has been unable to compete with what has become big agriculture, big corporate industrialized farming. And if the small farm in the United States is unable to compete on this level, what can we expect from the small farmer in Colombia? One of the reasons why big agriculture, big corporate agro producers have been so successful is because of the U.S. taxpayers. Farming in the United States is heavily subsidized by the taxpayer, up to hundreds of billions each decade. And growing up in a small farming community in Iowa, I thought it was the most politically boring place in the world, except for, when the caucuses came around and the candidates would show some interest in what Iowans think of in that context. But little did I realize that the field of corn across the street from where I grew up was one of the most politicized entities in the global market that exists. And how this comes home to Colombia is that the subsidies that go into U.S. agriculture production, along with the efficiency and the high yields and the technology that is able to create this, basically it allows them to produce under cost. And so this production under cost allows the U.S. to flood the market with cheap grain that small farmers cannot compete with. It extends to livestock production, etc. And the argument might go something like, well, you just gave the analogy of the small cane farmer in Belize. That seems like a very difficult way to make a living. Wouldn't we want to implement technology that make that kind of lifestyle better and create higher yields and things like that? And the discussion had turned to that the importation, I lost my train of thought. Well, we talked about that. For example, Haiti was used as an example where that livelihood would want to, or the small family farm in countries, or farming in general, needs to be sustained and built up in order not to depend so heavily on foreign markets. and in that context. And so, yes, certainly small farmers would want to maintain their living. They would want to improve their crop yield. They would want to earn a higher wage I'm sorry, not wage, but higher income for their livelihood, certainly. But I would argue also that the large corporate farm has many other disadvantages, and one of the major things to be worried about is that not only does it lower the price of food in the market, and it's undercutting the small farmer, which cannot compete. Also, it's creating an industrial pollution that needs to be regulated, and it needs to be basically disposed of properly. It's a toxic waste, whereas in a small farm, you can recycle the manure from animals, for example, and put it back into your crops as fertilizer. That is not the case with large industrial farms. And there's been examples in Mexico with CAFTA where those in close proximity are frequently the victims of such things like pollution in the water, for example, hog confinements where the waste has not been maintained. And what happened in Mexico, they give this example of a small town in Mexico where the small farmers were displaced by major agribusiness. Their lands were polluted by hog confinement, and they went looking for work in the United States. And where do they typically end up? They end up in agri-producing industry in the United States. So they're the ones working in, for example, meat packing plants, etc. So it's a cycle of displacement. And then, of course, we have states that are increasing their, or making it much more difficult and creating laws that are, I would say, egregious, but also will be found to be likely unconstitutional to drive immigrants out of the states. And so it's like this cycle of marginalization that occurs between that occurs, and those that are most marginalized are frequently small farmers, as was evident in Mexico. And again, there will be winners, and there will be entities that benefit greatly from the free trade agreement between the United States and Colombia. But small farmers will not be one of them, and as was argued, it is likely to actually increase rural poverty. And by increasing rural poverty, this is where we get to the context of, this is where we get to the important context of the reality of Colombia, where there are 5 million displaced persons due to the conflict, due to a civil war which has lasted approximately half a century, and has been in many ways complicated by the U.S. militarization of the war on drugs. And that's largely been through Plan Colombia, which I'm sure many of you know of. Where small farmers come in this context is that they provide the stability, if you will, in the countryside. Frequently they've been victims of violence, cross-violence between either the FARC, the left-wing FARC guerrillas, AUC, and the AUC, the right-wing paramilitary guerrillas, and the Colombian military. So there are several complicated actors involved in this conflict. So they provide a sort of stabilizing force. If they are displaced, they will add to this 5 million that are displaced. And those that are actually landless are in greater poverty than those that have land and are able to farm it. It's also very interesting that in the context of this free trade agreement, it was almost as if the United States did not take into account its current foreign policy in Colombia in regards to Plan Colombia, and as opposed to its trade agreement. It was like they were completely separate entities. And even the former president of Colombia, Uribe, had said, small farmers are the cornerstone of our state security. because if we lose small farmers, they could leave and join the conflict, or they could change to grow crops that they could actually make an income from, and those major crops are cannabis and opium and coca, from which cocaine is made. And so one of the main thrusts of U.S. foreign policy in Colombia through Plan Colombia has been to eliminate coca production, et cetera. Well, this free trade agreement could actually exacerbate that. And so it's basically going against, counteracting its own policy, again, which the U.S. taxpayer is paying for. Hundreds of $millions go to Colombia for military aid, and I say military aid because the vast majority of it does go to military. And let's go ahead. And again, one of the reasons why, and please tell me when my time is up. You got 5 minutes. Okay. One of the reasons why this particular agreement is very troublesome is because of the conflict in Colombia, but also the vast inequality of Colombia, and also, as I'll tie it together, is the inequilibrium of this particular trade agreement. So Colombia's land inequality is the 6th worst in the world. 1.3 Colombians own 70% of the land. It's basically large inequality. Again, I talked about the precarious existence of the small family farm. And then go on ahead. Okay, in terms of the imbalance in this particular agreement, it was interesting. From what I understand, this agreement went much further than other bilateral agreements that the U.S. government has signed, even with Mexico, although Peru was similar to this. And this agreement was largely negotiated under the administration of George W. Bush and was ratified by the U.S. Congress just this past year. And so this particular agreement is interesting in what I talked about in terms of the conflict and the desire to eliminate coca production. The points that the U.S. Negotiated or did not negotiate or refused to negotiate on are especially difficult for Colombia and much more harsh even than certain WTO standards. And so, and it creates an imbalance. So the U.S. is permitted to maintain its agricultural subsidies, giving it again a global advantage. But again, U.S. agriculture is subsidized, so it has an additional global advantage already. And it was able to exempt itself from certain tariffs, which will again have a burden for the small farmer. And then Colombia must grant U.S. the same preferential treatment for any other agreement it negotiates after this agreement. So if Colombia has a comparative advantage with another country and they want to trade, it has to incorporate that same preferential agreement with the United States, from what I understand. So what effect is this going to have on the Colombian small farmer overall? We talked about this. We talked about it will negatively affect 1.8 million people, which is roughly 10% of the population. Net income will fall, food will become more expensive, and then I spoke of environmental degradation. Go ahead. And then also that cycle of immigration and marginalization that I spoke about earlier.